Marriage was supposed to feel like a beginning, but for Steph, it felt like the final signature on a contract she had not fully read. The morning of the wedding arrived wrapped in perfection. Not the loud, chaotic kind, but the quiet, curated elegance that money arranged effortlessly. Everything moved on schedule, every detail aligned. Nothing was missing, except warmth. Stephanie noticed that absence before the ceremony even began, though she could not yet name it. Hi family, I need you to please help subscribe and watch my video to the end. Please remember to subscribe to my channel. Let us continue. Joshua Bright stood beside her at the altar with the calm confidence of a man used to winning. At 32, he had already built a reputation as a disciplined billionaire with an impeccable public image. His tailored suit fit him like intent, sharp and deliberate. To the guests, he looked like devotion personified. To Stephanie, he looked prepared, not moved. She was 26, graceful in a way that did not demand attention but quietly earned it. Stephanie carried herself with composure, her beauty understated yet striking, the kind that revealed itself more the longer one looked. She had agreed to this marriage with hope, not fantasy, but hope. Hope that affection could grow where respect already existed. Hope that partnership would follow the ceremony. The vows were exchanged flawlessly. Every word spoken carried weight, but not intimacy. Cameras captured smiles that appeared convincing enough to tell the story the world wanted. Applause followed. Congratulations flowed. The union was sealed not only by law but by expectation. Yet even as Joshua held Stephanie's hand, his grip felt formal, almost ceremonial. His attention drifted easily, already pulled toward responsibilities waiting beyond the moment. Stephanie noticed how quickly he transitioned from husband to executive, greeting guests with practiced ease, leaving her to smile beside him like a beautifully chosen accessory. The reception unfolded smoothly, filled with polite conversations and measured laughter. Nothing went wrong. That in itself felt strange. Stephanie found herself observing rather than participating, absorbing the reality of her new role. She was now Mrs. Bright, a name that came with privileges and pressures she had barely begun to understand. Joshua remained attentive in public, always present when required, always composed. But there was a distance in him that no one else seemed to notice. When the evening ended and they finally withdrew from the watchful eyes of others, Stephanie expected the atmosphere to soften. She expected a shift, a quiet closeness, something that belonged only to them. Instead, the night revealed the truth she had not prepared for. Inside the vast home that now belonged to both of them, Joshua moved with familiarity, already settled into routines shaped long before Stephanie entered his life. He explained, calmly, reasonably, that he preferred separate sleeping arrangements, at least for now. He framed it as discipline, as structure, as a way to maintain balance. He spoke of early mornings and demanding schedules, of the importance of rest and personal space. There was no anger in his tone, no hesitation, just certainty. Stephanie listened, standing in her wedding gown, the weight of silk and expectation pressing gently against her skin. She absorbed his words quietly, nodding where appropriate. She did not argue. She did not protest. Part of her believed this was temporary, a cautious step from a man unused to sharing his life. She told herself it was nerves. Joshua escorted her to the bedroom designated for her, ensuring she was comfortable before leaving with polite efficiency. The door closed softly behind him, and the sound lingered longer than it should have. Alone, Stephanie sat at the edge of the bed, her reflection staring back at her from the mirror. She looked exactly as a bride should, radiant, composed, newly married. Yet the room felt unfamiliar, like a space assigned rather than chosen. She reminded herself that marriages were built over time, that love did not always arrive loudly, that some men expressed care through stability rather than affection. Joshua had chosen her. That had to mean something. Still, as the house settled into silence, she became aware of how separate their lives already felt. The distance between their rooms seemed symbolic, a quiet line drawn before the marriage had even begun. Joshua, meanwhile, retired to the guest room without hesitation. The marriage had fulfilled its immediate purpose. Publicly, he was now a married man, grounded, respectable, aligned with expectation. Privately, nothing needed to change. His life remained structured, uninterrupted. Sleep did not come easily to Stephanie that night. She replayed the day in her mind, searching for moments of genuine connection. They existed, but they were fleeting, overshadowed by formality. She wondered if she had imagined the closeness she thought would follow the ceremony. As dawn approached, she finally rested, holding onto the belief that this was simply the beginning. That tomorrow would feel different. That intimacy would grow with familiarity. She did not yet realize that the marriage had already been defined. Not by love, but by function. And in that quiet house, on the very first night as husband and wife, Steph became something she had never anticipated being, a wife in title and a partner only on paper. Morning arrived gently, filtered through tall windows and quiet hallways, but it did not bring the shift Stephanie had hoped for. The house woke before she did. Staff moved with practiced silence, schedules already in motion. Somewhere in another wing, Joshua Bright had started his day long before sunrise. Stephanie realized this only when she came downstairs and found his place at the table untouched. At first she assumed it was coincidence, one early meeting, one demanding morning. She told herself that shared breakfasts would come later once the novelty of married life settled. But days passed, then weeks, and the pattern formed with unnerving clarity. Joshua left early, always early. His mornings were efficient, uninterrupted, managed through assistants and digital calendars that did not include her. When he returned, it was late, often after the house had quieted again. Their interactions became brief, courteous moments in passing, exchanges of information rather than connection. They lived under the same roof, yet their lives unfolded on parallel lines that never intersected. Meals were no longer shared experiences but scheduled necessities. Stephanie ate alone more often than not, seated at a long table that seemed too large for one person. The silence was not hostile, it was indifferent. No tension, no arguments, no raised voices, just the steady absence of intimacy. Joshua communicated efficiently. When needed, messages came through short texts or through staff relaying instructions about upcoming appearances or commitments. Everything was practical. Everything had purpose. Nothing felt personal. Stephanie adjusted outwardly with grace. She learned the rhythm of the house, the expectations attached to her role. She attended events when required, stood beside Joshua when appearances demanded it, and smiled when cameras turned in their direction. From the outside, the marriage looked composed and functional. Inside, something quietly unraveled. She began to notice how little space she occupied in Joshua's inner world. He did not ask about her day. He did not linger in shared rooms. Even when they were physically present together, his attention remained elsewhere, focused, distant, already moving ahead to the next obligation. At night, the separation felt more pronounced. Stephanie would retreat to her room while Joshua disappeared into his own routine, unseen and uninterrupted. The house settled into a pattern that mirrored their marriage, structured, quiet, and emotionally empty. There were moments when Stephanie tried to bridge the gap without confrontation. She adjusted her schedule to align with his, hoping coincidence might create closeness. She waited up some nights, listening for his return, imagining that perhaps shared silence could become shared comfort. It never did. Joshua remained polite, controlled, and emotionally unavailable. He was not cruel. He did not dismiss her outright. That made the distance harder to define, harder to challenge. There was nothing obvious to fight against, no clear wrongdoing, just neglect wrapped in civility. Gradually, Stephanie became aware of how invisible she felt within her own marriage. Not ignored in a dramatic sense, but overlooked in subtle ways that accumulated quietly. Her presence did not alter Joshua's routine. Her absence would not disrupt it either. The realization settled slowly. Like dust in a room, no one entered. She began to feel less like a wife and more like a carefully placed piece of decor, chosen thoughtfully, positioned deliberately, and then forgotten once the room was complete. The house reflected that feeling. Beautiful, expansive, and impersonal. It held space but offered no warmth. Stephanie found herself wandering its halls during the day, touching surfaces that belonged to a life she had married into but not fully entered. Everything around her spoke of Joshua's control, his preferences, his systems. There was little evidence of shared decision-making, little room for spontaneity. Still, she did not complain. Part of her clung to patience. She reminded herself that marriage was an adjustment, especially to a man whose life had been shaped by discipline and ambition. She believed that consistency might eventually soften him, that familiarity would breed affection. Yet as time passed, hope began to feel less like optimism and more like self-deception. Joshua's life continued uninterrupted. Meetings replaced moments. Travel replaced togetherness. Even when he was home, he remained emotionally elsewhere, his presence more symbolic than real. Stephanie, on the other hand, started to shrink within the marriage. Not visibly, not dramatically, but internally. She spoke less. She asked fewer questions. She learned to occupy space quietly, careful not to disturb a life that seemed complete without her. The absence of conflict became its own kind of conflict. There were no arguments to resolve, no misunderstandings to clarify, only a growing silence that settled deeper with each passing day. By the end of the first month, the truth was undeniable. This was not a temporary phase. This was the structure of their marriage. Separate rooms, separate schedules, separate emotional lives. And somewhere between the courtesy and the calm, Steph realized that loneliness could exist even in a house full of people, and that being married did not necessarily mean being chosen. By the time Stephanie accepted that loneliness had become a quiet fixture in her marriage, she also began to understand something more unsettling. The distance between her and Joshua was not accidental. It was organized. The rules did not arrive written or spoken aloud. They revealed themselves slowly, through repetition and restraint, through what was permitted and what was quietly discouraged. Stephanie learned them the way one learns the layout of a dark room, by bumping into invisible boundaries. Joshua's private office was the first boundary. It occupied a section of the house that felt separate from the rest, shielded by doors that were always closed and an atmosphere that discouraged intrusion. Stephanie passed by it often, aware of its presence, aware that it was not meant for her. She did not need to be told. The message was embedded in Joshua's behavior, in how he treated that space as sacred and solitary. His schedule became another unspoken rule. Joshua's time was not something to be questioned or negotiated. Meetings appeared suddenly. Travel was announced, not discussed. Stephanie learned about his plans through staff updates or last-minute adjustments to her own obligations. The marriage functioned around him, never with him. Public affection existed only when it served a purpose. At events, Joshua placed a hand at her back, guided her through rooms, stood close enough to suggest unity. The moment the obligation ended, the distance returned. The transition was seamless, practiced, almost automatic. Stephanie noticed how easily he switched roles, husband when required, executive always. She tried carefully to introduce softness into the structure. One evening, she arranged a private dinner, hoping that the quiet intimacy of a shared meal might open space for connection. She chose simplicity over spectacle, something personal rather than impressive. It felt like a small, reasonable attempt. Joshua canceled hours before it was meant to happen. The reason was efficient, unembellished and final. Work demanded his attention. There was no suggestion of rescheduling, no acknowledgement of what the gesture might have meant. That was when Stephanie began to feel the weight of the rules pressing in. The house, which once felt merely large and impersonal, now felt controlled. Every space had its function, every routine had its purpose, and she was expected to adapt, not contribute. Her role was to fit neatly into a system already perfected without her. Joshua did not ask her opinion on decisions that affected them both. Renovations happened without consultation. Travel plans were arranged without discussion. Even social commitments were dictated by what benefited his image and alliances. Stephanie existed within the margins of Joshua's life, not at its center. Yet what made it difficult to confront was the absence of overt cruelty. Joshua was never harsh, never dismissive in obvious ways. He remained courteous, composed, and respectful on the surface. That surface politeness created doubt, made Stephanie question her own dissatisfaction. Was she expecting too much? Was this simply how marriages at this level functioned? She searched for reassurance in small gestures, in fleeting moments of proximity. Sometimes, when they stood side by side in public, she sensed a potential for closeness, something restrained but present. It kept her hopeful, kept her waiting. But waiting began to feel like standing still, while life moved past her. As weeks turned into months, the rules solidified. Stephanie stopped attempting spontaneous plans. She stopped expecting shared evenings. She learned to measure her presence, to remain agreeable, to avoid disrupting the structure Joshua relied on. The marriage became an environment she navigated, rather than a relationship she participated in. Joshua, for his part, seemed satisfied with the arrangement. The absence of conflict reinforced his belief that everything was functioning as intended. Stephanie fulfilled her role with quiet grace. The household ran smoothly. His public image remained intact. He did not notice the subtle withdrawal, or perhaps he noticed and interpreted it as understanding. Stephanie began to spend more time alone, cultivating routines that belonged solely to her. She explored interests that required no approval, filled her days with activities that created a sense of identity separate from being Mrs. Bright. It was not rebellion, it was survival. Still, a part of her grieved what could have been. She had entered the marriage prepared to build something shared. Instead, she found herself adapting to a life where partnership was implied but never practiced. The rules ensured efficiency, not intimacy. Order, not affection. The realization settled heavily. Joshua had not married her to share his life. He had married her to stabilize it. That understanding changed the way Stephanie saw everything that followed. Every canceled plan, every closed door, every polite distance became evidence of intention rather than oversight. The house no longer felt like a place she was meant to grow within. It felt like a carefully controlled environment where emotions were inconvenient and vulnerability unnecessary. And yet, despite the clarity forming in her mind, she remained silent. Not because she agreed with the rules, but because she was still trying to understand them, trying to understand him. She did not yet know that the structure Joshua relied on so heavily was already cracking beneath the surface. That revelation would come soon, unexpected, unguarded, and impossible to ignore. The first sign that Joshua's carefully controlled world was not as sealed as it appeared came quietly, almost accidentally, on a night that began like every other. The house had settled into its usual rhythm. Lights dimmed automatically, hallways emptied. Staff withdrew into the background, leaving the space calm and still. Stephanie moved through her evening routine without expectation, her body already accustomed to the silence that followed nightfall. Joshua had returned late, as usual, his presence marked only by the distant sound of a door closing somewhere beyond her room. She did not intend to notice anything unusual. Her attention was not searching. That was what made the moment so unsettling. As Stephanie passed near the private wing of the house, she became aware of a low, steady voice drifting through the corridor. Joshua's voice. It was not raised, not urgent. In fact, it was softer than she had ever heard it before. She slowed instinctively, not out of suspicion but curiosity. The sound carried a tone that felt unfamiliar, unhurried, attentive, warm. It was the kind of tone that suggested patience rather than command, ease rather than authority. This was not the voice he used with Steph. It was not the voice he used in meetings or public appearances, and it was certainly not the voice he used with her. Stephanie remained still, her presence unnoticed. She did not hear the words clearly, but she did not need to. The emotion behind them was unmistakable. There was care in his cadence, a gentleness that felt out of place within the rigid structure of the marriage she knew. The realization landed slowly, then all at once. Joshua was capable of softness. The thought unsettled her more than anger ever could. She had spent weeks convincing herself that his distance was a personality trait, that emotional restraint was simply how he moved through the world. Hearing him now, unguarded and intimate in a way she had never experienced, shattered that belief. When the voice faded and the moment passed, Stephanie continued on to her room as if nothing had happened. Her movements were calm, deliberate. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, something had shifted irreversibly. That night, sleep evaded her. Her mind replayed the sound, dissected it, compared it to every interaction she had shared with Joshua since their wedding. The contrast was stark. What she had overheard was not reserved for business. It was not professional warmth. It was personal. For the first time, doubt replaced patience. The following days did not bring immediate answers. Joshua returned to his usual patterns, his demeanor unchanged. He remained polite, distant, efficient. If anything, he seemed even more contained, as though aware, on some level, that something fragile had been exposed. Stephanie watched more closely now. She noticed the subtle shifts she had previously overlooked. The way Joshua's attention lingered on his phone at certain times of day. The faint softening in his posture after particular calls. The contrast between his emotional restraint at home and the ease she had glimpsed in that single moment. When she finally gathered the resolve to ask about the call, she did so calmly, without accusation. The response she received was predictable. Joshua framed it as business, routine, nothing of consequence. His explanation was smooth, practiced, and intentionally vague. But the damage had already been done. Stephanie did not challenge him. She did not press further. She absorbed the response quietly, aware that truth was not something he was prepared to share. What unsettled her most was not the possibility of deception, but the certainty that he was capable of emotional engagement, just not with her. The house began to feel different after that night. The silence, once merely empty, now felt loaded. Every absence carried implication. Every closed door suggested something withheld. Stephanie found herself replaying moments from the early days of the marriage, reinterpreting them through this new lens. The separate rooms, the canceled dinners, the carefully maintained distance. None of it felt accidental anymore. She began to understand that Joshua's restraint with her was not an inability to connect, but a choice. That realization marked the first true fracture in her perception of the marriage. It was not dramatic. There were no confrontations, no scenes, just a quiet awareness settling into place, heavy and undeniable. Joshua, meanwhile, remained unaware of the shift, or perhaps he sensed it and chose not to acknowledge it. His world continued to operate within the rules he had established. The marriage, from his perspective, remained stable. But stability built on omission is fragile. Stephanie did not become bitter. She did not lash out. Instead, she grew observant, attentive. She began to notice how little space Joshua allowed himself to be human within their shared life, and how easily that humanity surfaced elsewhere. The contrast was no longer ignorable. That night had revealed something essential. not about the other presence in Joshua's life, but about Stephanie's place in it. She was not the recipient of his vulnerability. She was not the space where he softened. And once a truth like that is seen, it cannot be unseen. The marriage had developed its first visible crack, small, perhaps invisible to others, but enough to let doubt seep through, enough to change the way Stephanie carried herself within the relationship. She no longer waited for closeness to arrive on its own. She no longer interpreted distance as temporary. Something fundamental had shifted, and with it, her understanding of what she was living inside. The quiet had taken on a new meaning. And somewhere beyond the walls of that carefully ordered house, a presence Stephanie had not yet met was already shaping the distance between husband and wife, long before Stephanie would ever know her name. Stephanie encountered Diana Height on an afternoon that was meant to be uncomplicated. The event itself was understated by design, purposeful, refined, and carefully curated to appear effortless. It gathered people who understood influence without needing to announce it, people who moved easily within circles shaped by money and discretion. Stephanie attended as she always did now, composed, observant, prepared to fulfill expectations without drawing attention to herself. Joshua arrived later than scheduled, his presence immediately shifting the room's energy. He moved through the space with ease, confident and assured, acknowledging familiar faces with restrained warmth. Stephanie followed at his side, her role clear and practiced. It was in that moment of transition, between arrival and engagement, that Diana entered their orbit. Diana Height did not announce herself. She did not demand attention. She simply belonged. Stephanie noticed her first because of Joshua's reaction. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once seen. His posture softened. His focus sharpened. Something in him shifted, the same quiet warmth Stephanie had overheard weeks earlier returning with effortless familiarity. Diana was poised in a way that suggested comfort rather than performance. Her presence carried confidence without aggression, elegance without excess. She spoke with assurance, moved with intention, and seemed entirely at ease within the environment Joshua navigated daily. What unsettled Stephanie most was not Diana herself, but the ease between them. Their interactions flowed naturally, free of the restraint that characterized Joshua's behavior at home. There was no stiffness, no guarded formality. Their attention lingered on one another longer than necessary, their expressions open in a way Stephanie had never been invited to witness before. Stephanie remained beside them, present but peripheral. She observed the dynamic with growing clarity, noting how Diana spoke to Joshua not as someone impressed by his status, but as someone familiar with his world. She did not seek approval, she assumed it. Joshua listened to Diana in a way he never listened to Stephanie, fully, attentively. His expression softened when she spoke, his composure easing into something warmer, more human. It was a smile Stephanie had never received. The realization settled heavily in her chest, sharp and undeniable. This was not a professional connection, not a casual acquaintance. This was familiarity shaped by shared time, shared understanding, shared intimacy, emotional if not physical. Stephanie remained graceful, her expression calm, her presence controlled. She did not reveal what she was processing. Years of composure served her well in that moment. No one watching would have guessed that something within her had shifted permanently. As the event continued, the pattern repeated itself. Diana moved easily beside Joshua, their proximity unforced, their interactions natural. When Joshua stepped away briefly, Diana did not appear unsettled or uncertain. She waited with quiet confidence, as though his return was assumed. That assumption spoke louder than any declaration could have. Stephanie noticed how others responded to Diana as well. There was recognition in their greetings, familiarity in their tone. Diana was not new to this world, and certainly not new to Joshua's place within it. When Joshua returned to Stephanie's side, the shift was immediate. The warmth receded. The formality returned. His attention divided again, his presence careful and contained. The contrast was jarring. Stephanie understood then that what she had overheard weeks earlier was not an isolated moment. It was part of a larger truth she had been shielded from. Diana Height was not an intrusion into Joshua's life. She was already embedded within it. As the afternoon progressed, Stephanie found herself reflecting on her own position. She was the wife, publicly acknowledged, legally bound. Yet she felt less known, less seen than the woman standing comfortably within Joshua's emotional space. The irony was not lost on her. When the event drew to a close, Joshua moved with efficiency once more, transitioning back into the role of husband without hesitation. Diana departed with quiet assurance, her presence lingering even after she was gone. Stephanie accompanied Joshua home in silence, her thoughts measured and controlled. She did not confront him. She did not ask questions. She had learned by now that truth did not arrive through direct inquiry in this marriage. Instead, it revealed itself through observation. That evening, alone in her room, Stephanie replayed the interactions in her mind. The ease, the familiarity, the smile. None of it aligned with the version of Joshua she had come to accept as emotionally unavailable. The conclusion formed slowly, but with devastating clarity. Joshua was not distant by nature. He was selective. Diana Height represented a part of him that Stephanie had never been invited to access, a softness he reserved, a warmth he protected. Whatever existed between them had been cultivated deliberately, away from the structure and expectations of his marriage. Stephanie did not yet know the full extent of their connection. She did not need to. What she had seen was enough to confirm that her marriage existed alongside something else, something real, something alive. That night marked the end of uncertainty. There was no longer a need to question her instincts, no longer a reason to explain away the distance. The truth had stepped into the light, elegant and self-assured, and introduced itself without words. Stephanie lay awake, not in anger but in quiet reckoning. The marriage that had felt like a merger now revealed its deeper fracture. She was not competing with Diana Height. She was living parallel to her. And for the first time since the wedding, Stephanie understood that what she was facing was not emotional neglect born of circumstance, but a choice that had been made long before she ever said yes. After the afternoon where Diana Height stepped so effortlessly into view, Stephanie stopped searching for reassurance. Something inside her had shifted from uncertainty to awareness, and with that awareness came clarity. She no longer asked herself whether she was imagining things. She began, instead, to observe. Joshua's behavior changed in ways so subtle that only someone living beside him would notice. His absences became more predictable. Certain days of the week carried the same explanations, delivered with the same calm efficiency. Travel appeared on his schedule with little notice, always framed as unavoidable. Stephanie learned not to ask where he was going, not because she had been told not to, but because the answers no longer mattered. Patterns replaced excuses. When Joshua stayed away overnight, the house felt different. Not emptier, but quieter in a way that suggested intentional absence. Stephanie would wake in the morning to a stillness that felt deliberate, as though the house itself understood that his presence was not required for it to function. She noticed the precision of it all. Joshua did not disappear randomly. His absences followed a rhythm, aligned with specific days, specific commitments that never seemed to change. It was not chaos. It was coordination. Stephanie did not confront him. She did not demand explanations or clarity. By now, she understood that words were not where the truth lived in this marriage. It lived in repetition, in consistency, in the small details that revealed more than any confession ever could. Her awareness sharpened. She began paying attention to the way Joshua prepared before leaving. There was a care in his movements on those days, a deliberate attention to detail that differed from his usual efficiency. He appeared more relaxed, less rigid. His energy softened, the same way it had when Diana was near him. That softness never appeared when he was leaving for routine business. The confirmation continued quietly, unfolding in places Joshua likely assumed were invisible. Stephanie noticed changes in his digital presence, the subtle shifts in his online footprint. He was careful, disciplined, but not invisible. Certain locations repeated themselves in the background of shared spaces. Certain faces appeared consistently in proximity to his. Diana's height was never overtly displayed. There were no declarations, no public acknowledgments. Instead, there was consistency, presence, a sense of shared environment that could not be accidental. Stephanie did not feel shocked. The truth had announced itself gradually, allowing her time to process it without collapse. What surprised her was the absence of rage. What she felt instead was something quieter, heavier. Recognition. Joshua was not living a double life in chaos. He was managing parallel worlds with intention, one built on image and stability, the other on connection and desire. Stephanie belonged firmly in the first. The realization reframed everything. She understood now why Joshua treated their marriage with such precision, why he kept it controlled, predictable, emotionally contained. The marriage was not a place for expression. It was a structure designed to hold appearances steady while his real emotional life existed elsewhere. Stephanie's role became painfully clear. She was not a partner meant to be known. She was a presence meant to be respected, a symbol meant to remain undisturbed. Once she saw it that way, the pieces aligned seamlessly. Joshua's patience with Diana, his warmth, his willingness to linger in her presence, those were not accidents or impulses. They were investments, time and emotion directed intentionally, while Stephanie received obligation and routine. The absence of explicit evidence did not weaken the truth. It strengthened it. There was nothing impulsive or careless about Joshua's actions. He was deliberate in everything he did, including who he allowed himself to feel with. Stephanie began to detach quietly. She stopped adjusting her schedule around his, stopped waiting for his return. She reclaimed her evenings, filling them with activities that grounded her, that reminded her of herself outside the marriage. She began to move through the house with greater independence, no longer orienting herself around his presence or absence. Joshua noticed the shift but misread it. To him, Stephanie appeared compliant, settled, understanding. She no longer asked for shared time. She no longer attempted intimacy. She fit even more neatly into the role he had designed for her. What he did not recognize was that her silence no longer came from patience. It came from acceptance. Stephanie did not need proof delivered through confrontation. She did not need confirmation through admission. The truth had revealed itself in patterns too consistent to deny. Joshua was seeing another woman. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but with care, intention, and emotional presence he had never offered his wife. That knowledge changed the way Stephanie saw herself within the marriage. She was no longer confused by the distance. She was no longer searching for warmth where none was meant to exist. She began to understand that her marriage was not failing. It was functioning exactly as Joshua intended. The understanding brought a strange calm, a clarity that replaced longing with resolve. Stephanie stopped imagining what could be and began focusing on what was. And what was a marriage that existed in name, structure, and public presentation, but not in truth. The confirmation did not arrive with heartbreak. It arrived with quiet certainty. Joshua's world had room for affection. It simply did not have room for it with her. Stephanie did not yet know what she would do with this truth. She only knew that it could not be unseen, unlearned, or ignored. The distance between them was no longer ambiguous. It was deliberate. And with that realization, Stephanie crossed an internal line. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was no longer hopping for inclusion. She was preparing herself, emotionally, mentally, quietly, for a reality where she would no longer define herself by a marriage that had never truly included her. The roommate reality was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. Steph no longer needed patterns or subtle signs to understand her place in Joshua Bright's life. The awareness she had gained in the weeks prior had solidified into a quiet, unshakable truth. She was living in a marriage that existed for appearances, not for intimacy. The realization had begun as a whisper, a faint shadow at the edges of her consciousness. Now, it was a clear and undeniable presence, shaping every thought and every move within the house. She stopped waiting for gestures that would never come. She stopped imagining evenings filled with conversation, laughter, or closeness. Instead, she began to observe Joshua not as a husband but as a man living alongside her, separate, structured, and deliberately detached. He moved with the same precision as always, courteous in public, polite at home, but never softened by her presence. The warmth she had glimpsed in moments long ago belonged elsewhere. She saw it now in the way he left each morning without hesitation, the way he returned late without acknowledgement, and the way his attention was entirely consumed by responsibilities or by someone else. Diana Height's presence in his life was no longer a subtle suspicion. It was a quiet reality she could not ignore. Every absence, every late return, every softened tone she had once overheard, all pointed to the same conclusion. She was not the recipient of his emotional energy. She was not his chosen confidant, his safe harbor, or his companion in life. She was a roommate in name only. This clarity was liberating, in a strange way. Stephanie no longer strained herself trying to align with a husband who had never intended for her to be central to his life. She moved through the house with intentional independence. She stopped planning her days around his schedule. She stopped measuring her presence by his attention. She reclaimed spaces that had felt distant before, the library, the small balcony overlooking the garden, even the corner of the living room where sunlight fell in the late afternoon. Those spaces became hers, zones of quiet control where she could breathe without waiting for approval. Joshua, meanwhile, noticed the shift but misread it entirely. He observed her composure and calm, interpreting it as compliance and satisfaction. He did not realize that her detachment was not agreement. It was preparation. Her calm was a shield. Her independence was a signal that she was learning to exist outside the parameters he had set. He continued his routines, unaware that the dynamics of their home were subtly changing. He believed the house and marriage were operating precisely as he designed. He did not see that the quiet, orderly compliance was not participation, it was detachment in motion. Stephanie's evenings became her own. She filled them with work, reading, and walks through the house and gardens, moving as if she were living somewhere entirely separate. She did not isolate herself out of bitterness. She did not indulge in resentment. Instead, she cultivated autonomy within the very walls that had once felt restrictive. It was quiet empowerment, claiming a life that existed alongside the one Joshua controlled, not within it. Even their interactions followed this new reality. Breakfasts were still solitary, dinners rarely shared, conversations limited to necessary exchanges. Yet the absence of closeness no longer carried frustration. It carried clarity. The emotional gap between them was no longer something to be bridged. It was the framework of her life, the stage upon which she now stood firmly and unapologetically. There were no confrontations, no dramatic scenes. This was not a rebellion. This was the recognition of truth, followed by a deliberate choice to live within it without losing herself. Stephanie did not yell, cry, or demand attention. She observed, adapted, and retained her dignity in ways Joshua could neither control nor anticipate. And in this quiet, calculated detachment, Stephanie discovered something profound. She no longer needed validation from him. The marriage had stripped her of closeness, but it could not take her sense of self. She began to realize that intimacy was not defined by proximity or titles. It was defined by presence and choice, and Joshua's choices had made one thing clear: he would never make her central to his life. She accepted that fully, without bitterness, without tears. She moved through her days as a roommate with intention, with grace, and with awareness. She was living in the house, sharing space, yet she was no longer sharing her life. That night, as she lay awake alone in her room, the one she had come to inhabit as her own, Stephanie felt a quiet sense of resolve. The marriage had always been defined by structure and routine, and now she understood her role completely. She was not his partner in the ways that mattered. She was a participant in the arrangement, nothing more. And knowing that, she began to plan not how to win him back, but how to claim her life within the space he had allowed her to occupy. The roommate reality had arrived fully. It was no longer theoretical. It was present. And Steph finally was ready to live it on her own terms. With the roommate reality firmly established, Steph began to operate within the marriage on her own terms. Her world was quiet, controlled, and deliberate, built around the truth she had recognized. Joshua Bright's affection and attention were not hers to claim. And once she accepted that, a surprising sense of freedom began to grow inside her. She stopped trying to anticipate his needs or align her life with his schedule. She no longer lingered in the halls, waiting for his return. She stopped crafting moments meant to elicit warmth that would never come. Each day, she reclaimed little corners of her existence, slowly carving out autonomy within a home that had once felt entirely defined by him. Her mornings were hers. Her evenings were hers. Her thoughts, her reflections, her choices existed independently, untethered from the man who shared her last name. Silence became her ally. She no longer saw it as an emptiness or a failing of the marriage, but as a shield. It protected her from the disappointment of unreciprocated expectation. It allowed her to move through life fully aware of her worth and her agency, without needing validation from Joshua. In the quiet, she discovered the subtle power of self-possession, the dignity that arises from living without dependence on someone else's attention or affection. Joshua noticed the change immediately, though he did not understand it. To him, Stephanie's calm detachment appeared as compliance, as if she had adjusted completely to the rules of the household. He continued to leave early, return late, and manage his private life with the same precise efficiency, unaware that the woman beside him was no longer waiting for him to prioritize her. She was present, yes, but only on her own terms. Her presence had shifted from expectation to observation, from desire to neutrality, and he misread it as contentment. Stephanie's days were structured differently now. She spent mornings walking through the gardens, reading in quiet nooks of the house, and tending to personal projects that had long been deferred in pursuit of shared life that never materialized. Afternoons were occupied with work, correspondence, and skill building. Evenings, once dominated by anticipation and hope, became times of reflection, self-discovery, and planning. Every choice she made reinforced her independence, yet she moved through it with grace, not resentment. Her life became full without his engagement, rich with purpose without the need for external validation. She also cultivated subtle forms of presence within the house. Rooms once empty of warmth became hers to inhabit fully. She arranged spaces according to her preference. She lingered in places she had avoided when she still held hope for connection. She existed fully in the house, not as a shadow beside Joshua, but as a person recognized by her own choices. Her autonomy was quiet, understated, but undeniable. Joshua, on the other hand, continued to operate in his world of structure and efficiency. He remained courteous, efficient, and composed. He did not notice the shift because it was silent. He misinterpreted her independence as acquiescence, her calm as understanding, her quiet as approval. Yet the foundation of the marriage had subtly changed. For the first time, Stephanie existed without him, and he had no control over it. The household itself mirrored this shift. Stephanie's presence became less about her connection to Joshua and more about her ownership of space. The rooms she walked through, the meals she prepared for herself, the routines she built, they were all acts of self-possession. She was no longer a participant in someone else's narrative. She was writing her own, quietly, deliberately, and without apology. Even Diana Height, though not yet openly confronted, became a silent benchmark in Stephanie's life. Her awareness of Joshua's attention elsewhere no longer provoked desperation. It provoked clarity. She understood that the house contained parallel existences, one curated by Joshua for appearances, and one carved by her for dignity. And she had claimed the latter fully, without confrontation, without drama, without visible upheaval. Stephanie's quiet dignity began to exert its own subtle pressure. Her independence and calm resilience created a contrast to the structure Joshua had imposed. He could maintain control over appearances, schedules, and routines, but he could not control her sense of self. He misread it, underestimated it, and in doing so, revealed the first cracks in his perception of the marriage as entirely functional. There was no confrontation that evening, no heated exchange, no emotional reckoning. Just Stephanie, sitting in her room, feeling fully herself for the first time in weeks. She understood that her life had already shifted in ways that would ripple through the household over time. She was present physically, yes, but emotionally and mentally, she existed beyond his reach. The dignity of silence became her refuge and her weapon. She no longer sought intimacy or validation from Joshua. She did not dwell on absence or betrayal. Instead, she moved with awareness and intention, inhabiting the house and her own life fully, quietly, completely. And in this stillness, Steph realized something transformative. She no longer needed to fight to be seen, heard, or valued. She simply existed as herself, and that existence was undeniable. It was a power Joshua could not anticipate, and in that quiet, controlled manner, Stephanie began to reclaim more than just space. She began to reclaim herself. Steph had settled into her quiet, deliberate life within the Bright household. She no longer sought Joshua's attention, no longer measured her worth by his presence, and no longer expected intimacy where none had been offered. Her calm independence became a quiet force within the home, one that neither Joshua nor anyone else could easily disrupt. And yet, the shift was about to collide with forces Stephanie had only observed from the edges of her carefully controlled life. Diana Height began to move in ways that could no longer be ignored. She was no longer just a presence in Joshua's world, she was an emerging priority. Invitations, appearances, shared time outside the home. Subtle but consistent patterns revealed that Diana was stepping forward, claiming a place that Stephanie had once assumed was hers by default. Where Stephanie had adapted to distance, Diana actively engaged Joshua's warmth. The contrast was impossible to miss. Diana's presence drew attention, subtly shifting Joshua's focus, and Stephanie watched without emotion, only awareness. Joshua began to feel pressure from this dynamic, though not in the ways one might expect. He remained in control in public, orchestrating events, appearances, and routines. But he began to sense Stephanie's quiet detachment in new ways. No longer waiting for him, no longer seeking validation, she existed alongside him fully, independently, and with a presence that required no acknowledgement. For the first time, he experienced the effects of his neglect, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through absence of need. She no longer relied on him, and that absence of dependence shifted the balance subtly, imperceptibly, but unmistakably. Stephanie's power lay in her quiet observation. She no longer reacted to Joshua's absences or attention elsewhere. She simply moved through her life fully, deliberately, cultivating her own identity within the same space he occupied. Her independence became a mirror he could not break. Every calculated absence, every structured routine of his, now encountered the reality that Stephanie no longer defined herself by them. She was whole, self-contained, and unshaken. Diana's attempts to assert influence, through charm, presence, or social proximity, highlighted this dynamic further. Where Joshua's attention had once been a prize Stephanie sought, it now became a window into his own priorities, a space she observed without envy. She noted the small gestures, the lingering touches, the ease in his expressions that had never been reserved for her. But instead of succumbing to jealousy, she allowed the truth of it to strengthen her resolve. The marriage was no longer about winning affection. It was about understanding her own position and refusing to be diminished by it. The household began to operate under a new tension, subtle but palpable. Joshua's structured routines and Diana's emerging presence intersected with Stephanie's quiet independence. Where once he had moved through life unchallenged, he now navigated a home in which one woman demanded attention and warmth, and another existed fully without needing him. Stephanie's calm strength began to influence the dynamic in ways he did not anticipate. The very rules he had imposed, control, order, predictability, were being undermined, not through rebellion but through quiet, consistent self-possession. Stephanie understood the shifting balance with clarity. She did not attempt to interfere. She did not compete or protest. Instead, she observed, adapted, and allowed the structure of her own life to subtly redefine the household. Joshua had miscalculated. He had assumed compliance equated to dependence, that her quiet presence was a sign of need. He had not accounted for the quiet power that comes from self-reliance, from dignity, from existing fully without seeking permission or recognition. The power dynamic was no longer his to control. Diana's forwardness highlighted his choices. Stephanie's independence highlighted her own. In the space between them, Joshua began to realize that influence was shifting slowly, and in ways he could neither orchestrate nor predict. For Stephanie, this realization was liberating. She no longer measured herself by his attention or by the presence of another woman. She existed fully in her own right, quietly, deliberately, and with a calm dignity that could not be shaken. The marriage was no longer a relationship defined by absence or neglect. It was a stage upon which she exercised her own authority through self-possession. Joshua, in his structured, precise way, began to sense this shift. He noticed subtle changes. Stephanie no longer deferred, no longer sought approval, no longer moved according to his routines. The house no longer reflected only his design. It reflected her autonomy as well, and for the first time he felt the consequences of treating a wife like a roommate. Not through confrontation or rebellion, but through the undeniable, quiet presence of a woman who had reclaimed herself. The power had shifted. And in that shift, Steph found her strength, not from anger, not from manipulation, not from competition, but from the clarity and independence she had cultivated within the very home Joshua had designed to contain her. The house felt different now. Not in its structure. Joshua Bright maintained his routines, his careful control over schedules, appearances, and spaces, but in the air itself. Every room seemed quieter, steadier, more reflective of the woman who had learned to exist fully within it, Steph. Her calm independence had settled into the very fabric of the home, an unspoken force that shifted the balance of power entirely. Joshua noticed it, of course. The polished precision he had relied on for years no longer guaranteed influence. Stephanie no longer sought his presence, no longer needed his attention, no longer measured her worth by his acknowledgement. She existed in a space of her own making, one that was emotionally impervious to his absences and indifference. And though he had believed he controlled the marriage entirely, he was discovering, gradually and uncomfortably, that he had miscalculated. Diana Height's influence, once subtle, had grown bolder. She began to expect more from Joshua, both in private arrangements and in the public eye. Invitations, small privileges, moments that once would have been inconspicuous now carried the weight of her claim to a part of his life. Joshua, caught between his structured marriage and the emerging assertiveness of Diana, found himself increasingly aware of Stephanie's quiet power. Her detachment was no longer a passive state. It was a visible, undeniable reality. Stephanie observed the unfolding dynamic with calm clarity. She did not confront Joshua, she did not challenge Diana, and she did not seek validation from either. She simply moved through her life with deliberate grace, maintaining routines, cultivating independence, and allowing the household to reflect her strength without spectacle. Where Joshua and Diana maneuvered for attention, she existed fully without needing it. Where once she had sought inclusion, she now claimed autonomy. The subtlety of her presence carried consequences that Joshua could not reverse. He felt the loss of control not because she argued or resisted, but because she no longer required him. Her silence, her composed independence, became an unshakable reminder of his neglect. The marriage that had been designed as a partnership in name only was now a mirror of choices made and opportunities lost. For the first time, Joshua confronted an undeniable truth. Neglect is a betrayal, even without raised voices or visible conflict. Stephanie had never been combative or loud, but her quiet withdrawal carried more weight than any argument could have. She had not demanded affection or acknowledgement. She had quietly reclaimed herself. And in doing so, she revealed the fragility of a marriage built on image and routine, rather than shared life and emotional engagement. Stephanie's choice, however, was no longer about him. She had spent months cultivating her own life, shaping her own routines, and asserting her own independence within the very walls he controlled. She could leave, reinvent herself, or remain detached, all options exercised on her own terms. Joshua's attempts at influence were ineffective. Her world no longer revolved around his decisions or attention. When the moment of decision arrived, though it was unmarked by drama, it was clear. Stephanie did not ask for explanations. She did not seek apologies. She did not bargain for the intimacy that had been withheld. She made a choice rooted in clarity. She would no longer participate in a marriage that existed for appearance rather than connection. The power had shifted fully, and for the first time, the consequences of his neglect were tangible and irreversible. Joshua recognized too late that a marriage cannot be sustained on compliance alone, that image, structure, and careful control cannot replace emotional presence. Stephanie's withdrawal was complete. She existed independently within his house, untethered from his priorities, unbound by his attention, and undiminished by his choice to love another. Diana could claim proximity, Joshua could attempt influence, but Stephanie had claimed herself, and in that she had power he could never reclaim. The story closed on quiet inevitability. No confrontation, no shouting, no public spectacle. Only truth. Neglect, even silent, is a betrayal. And in failing to value her, Joshua had not only lost influence, he had allowed her to reclaim her life entirely. Steph remained, whole, calm, independent, and finally, fully beyond the reach of a husband who had treated her as just a roommate.